Chapter 18, The Progressive Era, 1900 to 1916. It was late afternoon on March 25, 1911, when fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. The factory occupied the top 3 floors of a 10-story building in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of New York City. Here, some 500 workers, mostly young Jewish and Italian immigrant women, toiled at sewing machines producing ladies' blouses, some earning as little as $3 per week. Those who tried to escape the blaze discovered that the doors to the stairwell had been locked the owner's way. It was later charged of discouraging theft and unauthorized bathroom breaks. The fire department rushed to the scene with high-pressure hoses, but their ladders reached only to the 6th floor. Onlookers watched in horror as girls leaped from the upper stories. By the time the blaze had been put out, 46 bodies lay on the street, and 100 more were found inside the building. The Triangle Fire was not the worst fire disaster in American history. 7 years later, over 1,000 people had died in a blaze on the General Slocum excursion boat in New York Harbor. But it had an unrivaled impact on public consciousness. In its wake, efforts to organize the city's workers accelerated, and the state legislature passed new factory inspection laws and fire safety codes. Triangle focused attention on the social divisions that plagued American society during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, a period known as the Progressive Era. These were years when economic expansion produced millions of new jobs and brought an unprecedented array of goods within reach of American consumers. Cities expanded rapidly by 1920, for the first time, more Americans lived in towns and cities than in rural areas. Yet severe inequality remained the most visible feature of the urban landscape, and persistent labor strife raised anew the question of government's role in combating it. The word progressive came into common use around 1910 as a way of describing a broad, loosely defined political movement of individuals and groups who hoped to bring about significant change in American social and political life. Progressives included forward-looking businessmen who realized that workers must be accorded a voice in economic decision-making, and labor activists bent on empowering industrial workers. Other major contributions to progressivism were members of female reform organizations who hoped to protect women and children from exploitation, social scientists who believed that academic research would help to solve social problems, and members of an anxious middle class who feared that their status was threatened by the rise of big business. As this and the following chapter will discuss, progressive reformers addressed issues of American freedom in varied contradictory ways. The era saw the expansion of political and economic freedom through the reinvigoration of the movement for women's suffrage. The use of political power to expand workers' rights, and efforts to improve democratic government by weakening the power of city bosses and giving ordinary citizens more influence on legislation. It witnessed the flowering of understandings of freedom based on individual fulfillment and personal self-determination. At the same time, many progressives supported efforts to limit the full enjoyment of freedom to those deemed fit to exercise it properly. The new system of white supremacy born in the 1890s became fully consolidated in the South. Growing numbers of native-born Americans demanded that immigrants abandon their traditional cultures and become fully Americanized. And efforts were made at the local and national levels to place political decision-making in the hands of experts who did not have to answer to the electorate. The idea of freedom remained as contested as ever in progressive America. Okay. In urban An urban age and a consumer society. Farms and cities. The Progressive Era was a period of explosive economic growth, fueled by increasing industrial production, a rapid rise in population, and the continued expansion of the consumer marketplace. In the first decade of the 20th century, the economy's total output rose by 85%. For the last time in American history, farms and cities grew together. Farm families poured into the western Great Plains. More than 1 million claims for free government land were filed under the Homestead Act of 1862, more than in the previous 40 years combined. Irrigation transformed the Imperial Valley of California and parts of Arizona into major areas of commercial farming. But it was the city that became the focus of progressive politics and of a new mass consumer society. The United States counted 21 cities whose population exceeded 100,000 in 1910, the largest of them, New York, with 4.7 million residents. The 23 square miles of Manhattan Island were home to over 2 million people, more than lived in 33 of the states. The stark urban inequalities of the 1890s continued into the Progressive Era. Immigrant families in New York's downtown tenements often had no electricity or indoor toilets. 3 miles to the north stood the mansions of Fifth Avenue's Millionaires Row. According to one estimate, J.P. Morgan's financial firm directly or indirectly controlled 40% of all financial and industrial capital in the United States. The muckrackers. Some observers saw the city as a place where corporate greed undermined traditional American values. At a time when more than 2 million children under the age of 15 worked for wages, Lewis Hine photographed child laborers to draw attention to persistent social inequality. A new generation of journalists writing for mass circulation national magazines exposed the ills of industrial and urban life. The Shame of the Cities, 1904, by Lincoln Steffens, showed how party bosses and business leaders profited from political corruption. Theodore Roosevelt disparaged such writing as muckraking, the use of journalistic skills to expose the underside of American life. Major novelists took a similar unsparing approach to social ills. Perhaps the era's most influential novel was Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, 1906. Whose description of unsanitary slaughterhouses and the sale of rotten meat stirred public outrage and led to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. Immigration as a global process. If one thing characterized early 20th century cities, it was their immigrant character. The new immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, discussed in Chapter 17, had begun around 1890 and reached its peak during the Progressive Era. Between 1901 and the outbreak of World War I in Europe in 1914, some 13 million immigrants came to the United States, the majority from Italy, Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In fact, Progressive Era immigration formed a part of a larger process of worldwide migration set in motion by industrial expansion and the decline of traditional agriculture. During the years from 1840 to 1914, when immigration to the United States would be virtually cut off by the During the years from 1840 to 1914, when immigration to the United States would be virtually cut off, first by the outbreak of World War I and then by legislation, perhaps 40 million persons emigrated to the United States and another 20 million to other parts of the Western Hemisphere, including Canada, Argentina, Brazil, and the Caribbean. Numerous causes inspired this uprooting of population. Rural Southern and Eastern Europe and large parts of Asia were regions marked by widespread poverty and illiteracy, burdensome taxation, and declining economies. Political turmoil at home, like the revolution that engulfed Mexico after 1911, also inspired emigration. Most European immigrants to the United States entered through Ellis Island. Located in New York Harbor, This became, in 1892, the nation's main facility for processing immigrants. Millions of Americans today trace their ancestry to immigrants who passed through Ellis Island. At the same time, an influx of Asian and Mexican newcomers was taking place in the West. After the exclusion of immigrants from China in the late 19th century, approximately 72,000 Japanese arrived primarily to work as agricultural laborers in California's fruit and vegetable fields and on Hawaii's sugar plantations. Between 1910 and 1940, Angel Island in San Francisco Bay, the Ellis Island of the West, served as the main entry point for immigrants from Asia. Far larger was Mexican immigration. Between 1900 and 1930, some 1 million Mexicans, more than 10% of that country's population, entered the United States, a number exceeded by only a few European countries. By 1910, 1/7 of the American population was foreign-born, the highest percentage in the country's history. The immigrant quest for freedom. Like their 19th century predecessors, the new immigrants arrived imagining the United States as a land of freedom, where all persons enjoyed equality before the law, could worship as they pleased, enjoyed economic opportunity, and had been emancipated from the oppressive social hierarchies of their homeland. "America is a free country," one Polish immigrant wrote home. "You don't have to be a serf to anyone." Agents sent abroad by the American government to investigate the reasons for large-scale immigration reported that the main impetus was the desire to share in the freedom and prosperity enjoyed by the people of the United States. Although some of the new immigrants, especially Jews fleeing religious persecution in the Russian Empire, thought of themselves as permanent immigrants, the majority initially planned to earn enough money to return home and purchase land. Groups like Mexicans and Italians included many birds of passage who remained only temporarily in the United States. The new immigrants clustered in close-knit ethnic neighborhoods, with their own shops, theaters, and community organizations, often continued to speak their native tongues. Although most immigrants earned more than was possible in the impoverished regions from which they came, they endured low wages, long hours, and dangerous working conditions. In the mines and factories of Pennsylvania and the Midwest, Eastern European immigrants performed low-wage, unskilled labor, whereas native-born workers dominated skill in supervisory jobs. The vast majority of Mexican immigrants became poorly paid agricultural, mine, and railroad laborers, with little prospect of upward economic mobility. "My people are not in America," remarked one Slavic priest. "They are under it." Consumer freedom. Cities, however, were also the birthplace of massive consumption society that added new meaning to American freedom. During the Progressive Era, large downtown department stores, neighborhood chain stores, and retail mail-order houses made available to consumers throughout the country the vast array of goods now pouring from the nation's factories. By 1910, Americans could purchase, among many other items, electric sewing machines, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and record players. Leisure activities also took on the characteristics of mass consumption. Amusement parks, dance halls, and theaters attracted large crowds of city dwellers. By 1910, 25 million Americans per week, mostly working-class urban residents, were attending Nickelodeons, motion picture theaters whose 5-cent admission charge was far lower than that of vaudeville shows. The working woman. The new visibility of women in urban public places, at work, as shoppers, and in places of entertainment like cinemas and dance halls, indicated that traditional gender roles were changing dramatically in progressive America. As the Triangle Fire revealed, more and more women were working for wages. Immigrant women were largely confined to low-paying factory employment, but for native-born white women, the kinds of jobs available expanded enormously. By 1920, around 25% of employed women were office workers or telephone operators. Female work was no longer confined to young, unmarried white women and adult black women. In 1920, of 8 million women working for wages, 1/4 were married and living with their husbands. The working women, immigrant and native, working class and professional, became a symbol of female emancipation. "We enjoy our independence and freedom," was the assertive statement of the Bachelor Girls Social Club, a group of female mail-order clerks in New York. The desire to participate in the consumer society produced remarking similar battles within immigrant families of all nationalities, between parents and their self-consciously free children, especially daughters. Contemporaries, native and immigrant, noted how the novelties and the frivolities of fashion appealed to young working women who spent part of their meager wages on clothing and makeup and at places of entertainment. Daughters considered parents who tried to impose curfews or to prevent them from going out alone to dances or movies as old-fashioned and not sufficiently American. The rise of Fordism. If any individual exemplified the new consumer society, it was Henry Ford. Ford did not invent the automobile, but he developed the techniques of production and marketing that brought it within the reach of ordinary Americans. In 1905, he established the Ford Motor Company, one of dozens of small automobile manufacturing firms that emerged in these years. 3 years later, he introduced the Model T, a simple, light vehicle sturdy enough to navigate the country's poorly maintained roads. In 1930, Ford's factory in Highland Park, Michigan, adopted the methods of production known as the moving assembly line, in which car frames were brought to workers on a continuously moving conveyor belt. The process enabled Ford to expand output by greatly reducing the time it took to produce each car. In 1914, he raised wages at his factory to the unheard-of level of $5 per day, more than double the pay of most industrial workers, enabling him to attract a steady stream of skilled laborers. When other businessmen criticized him for endangering profits by paying high wages, Ford replied that workers must be able to afford the goods being churned out by American factories. Ford's output rose from 34,000 cars priced at $700 each in 1910 to 730,000 Model Ts that sold at a price of $316, well within the reach of many workers in 1916. That economic system based on mass production and mass consumption came to be called Fordism. The promise of abundance. As economic production shifted from capital goods, steel, railroad equipment, etc., to consumer products, the new advertising industry perfected ways of increasing sales, often by linking goods with the idea of freedom. Numerous products took liberty as a brand name or used an image of the Statue of Liberty as a sales device. Economic abundance would eventually come to define the American way of life, in which personal fulfillment was to be found through acquiring material goods. The maturation of the consumer economy gave rise to concepts, a living wage, and an American standard of living that offered a new language for criticizing the inequalities of wealth and power in a progressive America. Father John A. Ryan's influential book, A Living Wage, 1906, described a decent standard of living, one that enabled a person to participate in the consumer economy as a natural and absolute right of citizenship. His book sought to translate into American terms of Pope Leo XIII's powerful statement of 1894, Rerum Novarum, which criticized the divorce of economic life from ethical considerations, endorsed the right of workers to organize unions, and repudiate competitive individualism in favor of a more cooperative vision of the good society. For the first time in the nation's history, mass consumption came to occupy a central place in descriptions of American society and its future. Varieties of progressivism. The immediate task in the progressive view was to humanize industrial capitalism and to find common ground in a society still racked by labor conflict and experiencing massive immigration from abroad. Some progressives proposed to return to a competitive marketplace populated by small producers. Others accepted the permanence of the large corporation and looked to the government to reverse the growing concentration of wealth and ensure social justice. Still others would relocate freedom from the economic and political worlds to a private realm of personal fulfillment and unimpeded self-expression. But nearly all progressives agreed that freedom must be infused with the new meaning to deal with the economic and social conditions of the early 20th century. Industrial freedom. In progressive America, complaints of a loss of freedom came not only from the most poorly paid factory workers, but from better off employees as well. Large firms in the automobile, electrical, steel, and other industries sought to implement greater control over the work process. Efficiency expert Frederick W. Taylor pioneered what he called the scientific management. Through scientific study, Taylor believed the one best way of producing goods could be determined and implemented. The role of workers was to obey the detailed instruction of supervisors. Not surprisingly, many skilled workers saw the erosion of their traditional influence over the work process as a loss of freedom. These developments helped to place the ideas of industrial freedom and industrial democracy, which had entered the political vocabulary in the Gilded Age, at the center of political discussion during the Progressive Era. Lack of industrial freedom was widely believed to lie at the root of the much-discussed labor problem. Many progressives believed that the key to increasing industrial freedom lay in empowering workers to participate in economic decision-making via strong unions. Louis D. Brandeis, an active ally of the labor movement, whom President Woodrow Wilson appointed to the Supreme Court in 1960, maintained that unions embodied an essential principle of freedom, the right of people to govern themselves. The contradiction between political liberty and industrial slavery, Brandeis insisted, was America's foremost social problem. The Socialist Peasants and Eugene Debs. Economic freedom was also a rallying cry of American socialism, which reached its greatest influence during the Progressive Era. Founded in 1901, the Socialist Party called for the immediate reforms such as free college education, legislation to improve the conditions of laborers, and an ultimate goal, democratic control over the economy through public ownership of railroads and factories. Sorry, I thought I had to hiccup, but I don't. Okay. By 1912, the Socialist Party claimed 150,000 dues-paying members, published hundreds of newspapers, enjoyed substantial support in the American Federation of Labor, AFL, and elected scores of local officials. Socialism flourished in diverse communities throughout the country. On the Lower East Side of New York City, it arose from the economic exploitation of immigrant workers and Judaism's tradition of social reform. Here, a vibrant socialist culture developed, complete with Yiddish-language newspapers and theaters, as well as large public meetings and street demonstrations. In 1914, the district elected Socialist Mayor London to Congress. Another center of socialist strength was Milwaukee, where Victor Berger, a German-born teacher and newspaper editor, mobilized local AFL unions into a potent political force. Socialism also made inroads among tenant farmers in old populous areas like Oklahoma and in the mining regions of Idaho and Montana. No one was more important in spreading the socialist gospel or linking it to ideals of equality, self-government, and freedom than Eugene V. Debs, the railroad union leader who, as noted in the previous chapter, had been jailed during the Pullman strike of 1894. For 2 decades, Debs crisscrossed the country preaching that the control of the economy by a democratic government held out the hope of uniting political equality and economic freedom. While there is a lower class, proclaimed Debs, I am in it. While there is a soul in prison, I am not free. Through the Atlantic world of the early 20th century, socialism was a rising presence. Debs will receive more than 900,000 votes for president, 6% of the total in 1912. In that year, the Socialist Appeal to Reason, published in Girard, Kansas, with a circulation of 700,000, was the largest weekly newspaper in the country. AFL and IWW. Socialism was only one example of widespread discontent in progressive America. Having survived the depression of the 1890s, the American Federation of Labor saw its membership triple to 1.6 million between 1900 and 1904. At the same time, its president, Samuel Gompers, sought to forge closer ties with forward-looking corporate leaders willing to deal with unions as a way to stabilize employee relations. Most employers nonetheless continued to view unions as an intolerable interference with their authority and resisted them stubbornly. The AFL mainly represented the most privileged American workers, skilled industrial and craft laborers, nearly all of them white, male, and native-born. In 1905, a group of unionists who rejected the AFL's exclusionary policies formed the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW. Part trade union, part advocate of a workers' revolution that would seize the means of production and abolish the state, the IWW made solidarity its guiding principle. The organization sought to mobilize those who excluded from the AFL, the immigrant factory labor force, migrant timber and agricultural workers, women, blacks, and even the despised Chinese on the West Coast. The new immigrants on strike. A series of mass strikes among immigrant workers placed labor's demand for the right of collective bargaining at the forefront of the reform agenda. These strikes demonstrated that although ethnic divisions among workers impeded labor solidarity, ethnic cohesiveness could also be a basis of unity, so long as strikes were organized on a democratic basis. IWW organizers printed leaflets, posters, and banners in multiple languages and insisted that each nationality enjoy representation on the committee coordinating a walkout. It drew on the sense of solidarity within immigrant communities to persuade local religious leaders, shopkeepers, and the office holders to support the strikes. The labor conflict that had the greatest impact on public consciousness took place in Lawrence, Massachusetts. The city's huge woolen mills employed 32,000 men, women, and children, representing 25 nationalities. When the state legislature in January 1912 enacted a 54-hour limit to the work week, employers reduced the weekly take-home pay of those who had been laboring longer hours. Workers spontaneously went on strike. Wait, what? Oh, okay. When the state legislature in January 1912 enacted a 54-hour limit to the work week, employers reduced the weekly take-home of those who had been laboring longer hours. Workers spontaneously went on strike. In February, strikers devised the idea of sending strikers' children out of the city for the duration of the walkout. Socialist families in New York City agreed to take them in. The sight of children, many of whom appeared pale and half-starved, marching up Fifth Avenue from the train station led to a wave of sympathy for the strikers. The governor of Massachusetts soon intervened, and the strike was settled on the workers' terms. A banner carried by the Lawrence strikers gave a new slogan to the labor movement: "We want bread and roses too," a declaration that workers sought not only higher wages, but the opportunity to enjoy the finer things of life. Labor and civil liberties. The fiery organizer, Mary Mother Jones, who at the age of 83 had been jailed after addressing striking Colorado miners, later told a New York audience that the Union had only the Constitution, the other side had the bayonets. Yet the struggle of workers for the right to strike and of labor radicals against restraints on open-air speaking made free speech a significant public issue in the early 20th century. By and large, the courts rejected their claims, but these battles laid the foundation for the rise of civil liberties as a central component of freedom in 20th century America. The The IWW's battle for freedom of expression is a case in point. Lacking union halls, its organizers relied on songs, street theater, impromptu organizing meetings, and street corner gatherings to spread their message and attract support. In response to IWW activities, officials in Los Angeles, Spokane, Denver, and more than a dozen other cities In response to IWW activities, officials in Los Angeles, Spokane, Denver, and more than a dozen other cities limited or prohibited outdoor meetings. To rouse popular support, the IWW filled the jails with members who defied local law by speaking in public. Nearly all the free speech fights, however, the IWW eventually forced local officials to give way. Whether they agree or disagree with its methods or aims, wrote one journalist, all lovers of liberty everywhere owe a debt to this organization for keeping alight the fires of freedom. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to take a break, but then I'm going to come back for another 30 minutes.